They sent me a fine for unauthorized fishing and improper boat storage on a lake they swore belonged to the HOA. The only problem? The shoreline, the launch ramp, and the strip of land they'd been using for years all belonged to me. And by the time they realized it, their lake access was already gone. When I bought the cabin lot on Ashwood Lake, I wasn't looking for trouble. I was looking for quiet. That was the whole reason I picked that place instead of one of the newer neighborhoods closer to town. Ashwood had tall pines, clean water, decent fishing, and just enough distance from civilization to make people think twice before stopping by. The cabin itself wasn't fancy, just a sturdy one-story place with a wraparound porch, a gravel drive, and a boat shed tucked near the shoreline. But what sold me wasn't the house, it was the land. Specifically, a weird, narrow piece of shoreline parcel that came with it, about 14 acres total, including a strip along the north edge of the lake and a small, aging launch area that looked like it had been there since the 80s. The realtor mentioned it casually during closing. "This part's been a little loosely used by the neighboring HOA over the years," she said. That should have set off alarms, but at the time, I didn't think much of it. Loosely used sounded like maybe a couple of kayaks now and then. What it actually meant was that the HOA next door had spent years acting like my shoreline was theirs. The neighborhood was called Cedar Ridge Shores, one of those fake rustic developments with matching mailboxes, stone entry signs, and an HOA board that treated every pond, path, and patch of dirt within sight like they personally signed the deed. Their houses wrapped around the eastern side of the lake, but unlike me, they didn't have direct public lake frontage. The developers had apparently solved that problem years ago by relying on community access through the North Cove. My North Cove. And because nobody had challenged it in a long time, everyone in Cedar Ridge had quietly decided it was theirs by default. I didn't realize how bad it was until my first Saturday morning there. I had launched my little aluminum fishing boat before sunrise, spent a couple of hours trolling for bass, and came back just after 9 with a cooler, a sunburn, and exactly the kind of peace I had moved there for. I was backing the boat onto the trailer when a golf cart rolled up behind my truck. Out stepped a woman in a visor, white capris, and enough self-importance to make the pine trees lean away. "Excuse me," she said, "you can't keep that boat there." I looked around because for a second I thought maybe she was talking to someone else. She wasn't. "I'm sorry," I said. She pointed at my boat like it was a health code violation. "This launch area is regulated by the HOA. Boat storage has to be approved." I actually laughed. Not to be rude, well, not entirely, but because the idea of some stranger showing up on my shoreline to explain my own land to me was too ridiculous to process any other way. I told her this was my property. She smiled the way people smile when they think you're the confused one. "No," she said. "This is Cedar Ridge Common Lake access." That line would have been funny if she hadn't believed it with her whole soul. I told her calmly, "It absolutely is not." She folded her arms and said, "Then I guess you'll be hearing from the board." That should have been my warning. Instead, I made the mistake of assuming adults with clipboards eventually run into reality and adjust. Cedar Ridge didn't adjust. They escalated. 3 days later, I found an envelope tucked under the wiper blade of my truck. Inside was a printed HOA violation notice. Not a letter, not a request. A violation notice. It listed 2 infractions: unauthorized shoreline fishing activity and non-compliant vessel storage in common area access zone. The fine amount? $250. I stood there in my own driveway reading a fake fine from an HOA I didn't belong to, and for a full 10 seconds I couldn't even decide whether to laugh or frame it. They had cited me, on my own land, for fishing, on a lake I lived on, using my own boat. That's the kind of confidence only an HOA can produce. The letter was signed by the Cedar Ridge Shores Compliance Committee. Of course it was. I walked the notice straight to the trash, figuring maybe this was one overly enthusiastic board member freelancing stupidity. It wasn't, because a week later, another one came. This time, it included photos. Photos. Grainy little zoomed-in printouts of me standing on my dock with a fishing rod and my boat parked beside my shed. They had literally surveilled me on my own property to build a fake case for rules that didn't apply to me. That's when it stopped being funny. I called the number on the notice. A woman named Patricia answered in the tone people use when they're already prepared to deny your existence. I told her I was the owner of the parcel they kept citing. She responded with, "That's not what our access map shows." Their access map. Amazing. I asked if she had an actual deed. She said, "We've used that area for years." That's HOA logic in one sentence right there. If they've been wrong for long enough, they start calling it policy. I told her I wasn't paying a dime and that if anyone from Cedar Ridge stepped on my shoreline again, we'd have a different kind of conversation. She said, "We'll let legal handle it." Perfect. Because legal was exactly where this was headed. Before I called an attorney, I did what I always do when property lines start getting weird. I gathered paper, closing docs, parcel map, county GIS overlay, tax records, prior deed chain, and once I started digging, the whole thing got even better. Not only did I own the shoreline parcel and launch ramp outright, but the old developer paperwork suggested Cedar Ridge had never actually secured a formal lake access easement there in the first place. At some point, decades earlier, the original owner had apparently allowed informal neighborhood use for small watercraft, and instead of formalizing that with a recorded agreement, the HOA had just absorbed it into their mythology. That's how these things happen. One person lets someone cross a field in 1997, and by 2026, an HOA board is issuing citations like their maritime police. I hired a surveyor and a real estate attorney that same week. The survey confirmed exactly what I thought. The launch lane, the gravel pull-off, the dock stub, and the shoreline strip all sat squarely inside my parcel boundaries. No shared title, no HOA ownership, no recorded common area rights, just my land. My attorney sent Cedar Ridge a very simple cease and desist. It stated that their fines were invalid, that they had no enforcement authority over my property, and that any continued interference, trespass, or misrepresentation of ownership would expose them to liability. You'd think that would have ended it. It didn't, because HOA people don't process humiliation until it costs them something. Instead of backing off, the board doubled down. A week after the letter went out, I came down to the shoreline and found 2 orange cones blocking my launch lane and a laminated sign zip-tied to one of my posts that said, "Community Water Access, HOA members only." I just stood there for a second, taking in the audacity. They had physically marked my land as theirs. Again. On camera, by the way, because after the second fine notice I had installed trail cams and 2 solar security units facing the cove. And sure enough, the footage showed exactly who had done it. Patricia and a guy in a polo shirt I later learned was the HOA vice president. They arrived in a golf cart at 7:12 a.m., placed the cones, attached the sign, and drove off like they were installing a monument to their own stupidity. That was the moment I stopped trying to educate them and started preparing consequences. Here's the thing about land disputes. People love pretending they're philosophical until access gets involved. Once access gets interrupted, suddenly everyone becomes very interested in legal reality. So I checked with my attorney one more time, confirmed there was no public or HOA easement granting Cedar Ridge use of my launch corridor, and then I made a decision. If they wanted to treat my shoreline like common area while fining me for using it, then they could enjoy life without it. I ordered a steel farm gate, 2 treated posts, and a set of signs. The gate went up at the top of the gravel launch lane the following Friday. Clean install, locked, legal, professional. The signs were even better. Private property, no HOA access, no lake entry, and, just for flavor, fishing and boat use by owner permitted. Petty? Maybe a little. Accurate? Completely. The meltdown was immediate. By Saturday morning, there were 6 HOA residents standing outside my gate, like it was the Berlin Wall. Kayaks on roof racks, paddleboards in truck beds, fishing rods, coolers. Nobody yelling yet. Just that stunned, betrayed posture people get when the free thing they've been stealing for years suddenly costs boundaries. Then Patricia arrived. Of course she did. She marched up to the gate in sandals and a visor like she was about to liberate occupied territory. "You can't do this," she said. I was standing about 20 feet back near my boat shed, sipping coffee and enjoying one of the most satisfying mornings of my life. "I already did," I said. She pointed at the gate like it was personally offensive. "This is Cedar Ridge Lake access." I held up the county parcel map and said, "No, this is my land." She actually tried the lock, on camera, in broad daylight. Then she said, "You're interfering with community recreation." I said, "You fined me for fishing here." That shut her up for maybe half a second. Then came the best part. She said, "We have historical rights." I asked, "Recorded where?" Silence. Then some guy behind her muttered, "Wait, do we actually?" That one sentence did more damage to the HOA than any lawyer could have billed for. Because once residents start asking whether the board actually knows what it's talking about, the whole illusion starts cracking. Patricia tried to rally by threatening legal action. I said, "Please do." She said they'd have the county remove the gate. I said, "Please try." She said I was destroying neighborhood harmony. I said, "No, I'm ending trespass." She hated that answer because it translated the whole thing out of HOA language and back into normal adult reality. Over the next week, Cedar Ridge spiraled. Their Facebook group, yes, screenshots found their way to me, turned into a digital civil war. Half the residents were furious at me for taking away their lake access. The other half were furious at the board for apparently not actually owning the one amenity they'd been advertising for years in neighborhood listings and welcome packets. That part mattered. A lot. Because if you're selling homes and marketing private lake access through land you don't own, you're not just annoying, you're creating exposure, real exposure, especially when there are dues, maintenance budgets, and HOA brochures involved. My attorney knew that too. So when Cedar Ridge's lawyer finally contacted us, full of bluster and good faith discussion language, we were ready. We sent over the survey, title chain, camera stills, fake fine notices, photos of their unauthorized signage, and screenshots of resident materials describing the launch as a community amenity. Their tone changed fast. Very fast. Suddenly, nobody was talking about our lake access anymore. Now it was a long-standing area of informal community use. Amazing how ownership language shrinks the second documents show up. But the board still hadn't fully learned, because while the lawyers were talking, 2 Cedar Ridge residents decided to ignore the gate and carry their kayaks around the side through my tree line. Big mistake. Trail cams caught both of them cutting through the brush and dragging gear across my shoreline. I filed formal trespass complaints. Not dramatic ones, not emotional ones, just documented, boring, beautifully real complaints. That's when the HOA finally understood I wasn't bluffing. They asked for a meeting. We held it at a county conference room because I had zero interest in setting foot inside their clubhouse and listening to people who once fined me for fishing explain community values. Patricia was there, looking like she hadn't slept in a week. So was the vice president, the HOA attorney, my attorney, and one very tired county mediator who probably deserved hazard pay. The board opened with some nonsense about preserving neighbor relations. My attorney shut that down immediately by placing their fake violation notices on the table and asking, "Would you like to explain why your client attempted to fine a non-member landowner for using his own boat on his own parcel?" Nobody answered. Then we got to the part they really cared about. The gate. They wanted access restored before summer peak season. Of course they did. Their residents were furious, listings were getting awkward questions, and apparently at least one homeowner had already threatened to sue the HOA for misrepresentation. I listened to all of it, then said the simplest thing in the room: "You can't keep using something you don't own and then punish me for using it myself." That was the whole case. No speeches needed. In the end, they folded. Not because they suddenly discovered morals, but because reality finally got expensive enough. The agreement they signed was beautiful. Cedar Ridge formally withdrew all fake fines, issued a written acknowledgement that the shoreline and launch area were privately owned by me, notified residents that they had no right to access my land, and reimbursed my survey and attorney costs up to a negotiated amount. They also agreed to remove any reference to the launch area from HOA documents, maps, and amenity descriptions. And the best part? I was under absolutely no obligation to reopen access. None. Zero. They asked, politely this time, if I'd consider granting limited paid seasonal use. I said no. Not angrily, not emotionally, just no. Because after being treated like an intruder on my own shoreline, I had exactly zero interest in subsidizing their sunsets. Since then, life at Ashwood has been exactly what I wanted from the start. I fish when I want. My boat stays where I park it. My dock is quiet. The gate stays locked. Every now and then I'll see someone from Cedar Ridge standing on the far side of the cove, looking over at my little launch lane like it's some lost civilization. And honestly, I don't even blame the regular residents that much. Most of them were just trusting a board that acted like paperwork was optional. The real lesson here isn't about boats or fishing. It's about what happens when people confuse habit with ownership for long enough that they start believing it themselves. Cedar Ridge thought because they'd used my land for years, they had a right to it. Then they made the fatal HOA mistake. They tried to find the actual owner. And once they did that, they didn't just lose the argument, they lost the lake. So tell me, if an HOA fined you for fishing and using your own boat on land you owned, would you have shut down their lake access too? Drop your opinion in the comments and subscribe for more HOA revenge and entitled neighbor stories.